Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another Breath vs. Tears video. It's me, and today I want to look at the differences in how Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom handle combat. Now, while combat in video games may usually be a very complex topic to discuss, the mechanics of combat between Breath and Tears is really very similar in these two games. There's only a handful of differences, which is nice because it means that this video probably won't be half an hour long. The large differences that we will be looking at are game difficulty, enemy types, and comparing champions and sages. And then there are a few other odds and ends that we'll cover at the end of the video. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. Difficulty is a complicated thing to deal with in games. For a game like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, the difficulty needs to be at a level where the game is approachable for a broad audience of players. If a game is going to accommodate for less experienced players, more experienced players aren't going to feel challenged by the game. But if the game is going to be geared towards the more experienced players, it's going to be very difficult for the inexperienced players. So Breath and Tears both try to shoot for somewhere in the middle, neither overwhelming for noobs nor underwhelming for pros. But there's definitely some variance between the two games. Tears of the Kingdom is a little bit harder than Breath of the Wild. Now, for the relatively experienced gamers, which I assume most of you watching this are, it may be that you think that the higher difficulty of Tears makes it a better game, but I don't think that this is the case. Tears of the Kingdom's difficulty may make it the more appropriate game for you, but many casual players will probably prefer Breath of the Wild's difficulty. And it's not like there's a lack of challenge in either of these games. Both games boast a statistically comparable version of the Lynel as one of their hardest enemies. It's just that in Breath, sometimes you have to seek out challenges, whereas in Tears, you're more likely to just wander upon a genuinely difficult encounter. So I don't think that the difficulty difference really matters that much. At the end of the day, the difficulty difference isn't huge, and it's just a matter of it being tailored to slightly different audiences. And I don't hear you say, "Hey Barbecue, I thought this was a video about which game did better, and now you're saying that your first point doesn't even matter?" No. First of all, this is a comparison between these two games, and just because we can observe that they did something differently from each other doesn't mean that we can determine which way of doing things is better. Not every aspect of game design is so objective. Second, I wasn't finished yet. Breath has something that Tears of the Kingdom doesn't. Well, really, Breath has a lot of things that Tears doesn't, but for the purposes of discussing difficulty, there's one big thing, and that thing is Master Mode. Now, Master Mode was something that was added to Breath of the Wild as DLC, so while Tears of the Kingdom doesn't currently have a Master Mode, it may be added at a later date. However, it doesn't look like Tears will likely get such DLC, and either way, Tears currently lacks this added difficulty option. Master Mode is Breath of the Wild's Hard Mode. It does a handful of things to up the difficulty, like increment the ranks of the enemies and add enemy health generation. The ways in which difficulty is increased aren't super important for the purposes of this analysis. The important thing is that for the experienced player who's looking for a challenge, Breath of the Wild has a solution, and Tears of the Kingdom doesn't. So with regards to difficulty, Breath of the Wild is probably the better game. The first thing I've seen people consider when comparing the enemies in Breath and Tears is the number of enemy types. This is something that I find odd, since the numbers are comparable. Breath of the Wild has 28 enemy types, and Tears of the Kingdom has just a handful more at 35. That's not a huge difference, only a 25% increase, so I don't get why that's what people latch onto. Especially since in both these games, most of the enemies you're going to be fighting are just a handful of those enemy types, like Moblins, Bokoblins, and Lizphalos. So let's not worry so much about how many enemy types there are, and instead look at the design and effectiveness of some of the enemies that are exclusive to each game. Both games already have a decent variety just in their overlapping enemies. You fight a Bokoblin very differently from how you fight a Stone Talus, which you fight very differently from a Lynel, which you fight very differently from a Yiga Blademaster, and I could go on like this. But both of these games have some enemies that are unique to them, so let's see what they bring to the table, starting with Breath of the Wild. I think that only 2 Breath of the Wild enemies were removed in Tears of the Kingdom, so we may as well look at them both. The first is the Guardian Stalker, also known as the Vanilla Guardian, also known as a heart attack waiting to happen. Now, I didn't think I'd miss Guardians until I didn't have them, but I did really miss them playing through Tears of the Kingdom, and looking back on it, I realize it's because it's probably the most well-designed enemy in either of these games. The Guardian has this special place in Breath of the Wild where it serves as a sort of representation of your progress from noob to kinda alright at the game to actually competent. Early in Breath of the Wild, Guardians are absolutely terrifying, particularly on a first playthrough. They have a ton of health, deal a massive buttload of damage, and can fire at extremely long range, not to mention the fact that they're one of the fastest moving enemies in the game, or the fact that they can survive an ancient arrow shot if they aren't hit directly in one of their weak spots. When you encounter a Guardian early in the game, you either run, hide, or die, often two or all three of those things. Most other enemies, even if they're hard, can be avoided, but you can't always avoid Guardians. Then, as you slowly get better at the game and acquire better weapons and more health, you eventually reach a point where you can try to take on a Guardian. The first one will likely be quite difficult, and you may get incinerated a few times in the process, but eventually you can do it. And getting to that point where you can take on a Guardian is both hugely satisfying and a big confidence boost. Eventually, you may get to the point where Guardians are easy, or you can take on multiple Guardians at once, and that has its own brand of confidence boosting. So the Guardian is an enemy that does more than just give you something else to fight through, it's this representation of your own skill level, which I think is great design. The other Breath of the Wild exclusive enemy is the Guardian Scout. They're the ones with 3 arms that can hold up to 3 different weapons, and depending on if those weapons are high or low value and what kinds of weapons they are, you can tell how to best fight them. Guardian Scouts may be a little overused in the tests of strength, but they're a well-designed enemy that can have a near infinite number of variations. Alright, now let's look at a few Tears of the Kingdom enemies. I don't think that any of these have the near-perfect design of the Guardian Stalker, but there are some very well-designed Tears of the Kingdom exclusive enemies. And yes, I know some of these enemies are technically from earlier games, but they didn't take on this exact form. The Gleeok is a really epic Dragon-Hydra crossbreed that provides a significant late-game challenge. I would argue that some Lynels can be more difficult than standard-issue Gleeoks, so they aren't the be-all, end-all monster challenge, but they do add some variety to your late-game monster hunting. So it's a pretty good addition to the game. I like that Gleeoks also have 2 phases, which makes them more like a mini-boss than the other enemies in Tears. Gloomhands, or if you're being technical, Gloomspawn, are an enemy that was notoriously scary when Tears first came out. They were even compared to Breath of the Wild's Guardians as a kind of Tears of the Kingdom equivalent. However, they're not actually that difficult to defeat. Gloomhands have no ranged attacks and are incapable of climbing or flying, so they are easy to avoid and can be defeated at a distance with arrows, bomb flowers, laser carts, or any of the other dozens of options in Tears. Gloomhands may serve as little more than a quick Phase 1 to the Phantom Ganon battles, but I think that Gloomhands deserved a little more love from the developers than they got. Overall, though, they're still a really cool enemy conceptually, and they are pretty scary, at least on the first playthrough. The Battle Talus was one of my personal favorite additions in Tears of the Kingdom because it provided a very unique experience in that enemies would ride on the large platform on top of the talus. In this way, the Battle Talus wasn't just an enemy, but it was part of the battlefield itself, which is a really creative way to change up combat. There are other new enemies in Tears, like the Gibdos and the Flux Constructs, but I think you get the point. The enemies that Tears added are pretty good. Maybe not as good as the Breath of the Wild exclusive enemies, but pretty good nonetheless. So I'm not going to rule this in favor of either particular game. Anyway, let's move on to the next section. Alright, it's time to look at Breath of the Wild's champion abilities and Tears of the Kingdom's sage abilities. And I know that Tears' sages have collected a pretty bad rep, and I think that's for a good reason. But for the most part, Breath of the Wild's champions aren't fantastic either. This isn't a strength for either game. Breath of the Wild has one main problem with its champions' abilities, and that's the fact that most of the abilities are very passive. Both Durik's Protection and Mipha's Grace are, at the end of the day, survival boosters, as one gives you a few free screw-ups when you're trying to parry attacks, and the other basically increases your health. Urbosa's Fury is similarly passive, as it basically just gives you some splash damage and stun time when you make a charged attack. Annoying Birdman's Gale is much more useful as it gives you verticality, but it is more useful for exploration than it is for combat. It does have application in combat because you can use it to get a lot of bullet time, but none of the other 3 abilities have this level of utility or creativity. For the most part, these abilities just make the game easier, and it was already, relatively speaking, pretty easy, so it would have been really nice to see more variety in the kinds of champions abilities we got in Breath of the Wild. I don't think that the champions abilities necessarily make Breath of the Wild a worse game or anything, but with the exception of the annoying Birdman's Gale, they don't necessarily improve it either. Tears has its own problem with its sages, problems that have quickly become notorious in this community. So as most of us know, the sages aren't tied to buttons or button combinations or existing abilities. Instead, they manifest as these specters that you have to go interact with to activate their ability. At first glance, this may seem annoying, but nothing more than that. There's a decent amount of variety in their abilities, as one shoves enemies or yourself with a gust of wind, one basically launches a rolling fireball, one empowers an arrow with lightning, and one provides a temporary one-hit shield that can be dispersed into a ranged attack with a melee weapon. These abilities are a lot more imaginative than the Breath of the Wild abilities. The problem is that these specters participate in combat. Now, this participation is at first glance fine. The sages don't do a ton of damage, but they don't have to. They do a good job of distracting some enemies, so they're still useful as supporters in combat. The problem is that since they're fighting, they're constantly running around, often running away from you, and this can make it really annoying to try and activate their abilities, as you may have to chase them around for a bit, and all the while you're probably being chased yourself and possibly being shot at by other enemies. In my experience, if you want to get full utility out of all of your sages, then you're going to spend most of combat just running around trying to activate all of them, which means you don't actually get to participate much in the fight yourself. A second problem is that the sages sometimes follow you closely enough that you may activate them by accident. There was a bit of a meme at this point of players trying to pick up items, only to activate the wind gust and blow all the items off the nearest cliff. Which is funny the first time, and only the first time. After that, it's just annoying. There is a sort of remedy to the sage problem in Tears of the Kingdom, which is nice. You can just turn them off, which is exactly what I did. I only used the sages in a few small areas in Tears. I basically pulled them out for the biggest monster camps and for the Queen Gibdo fight, and that was about it. Turning sages off isn't the most elegant solution to the whole problem, because it means that, well, you don't have the sages. I still appreciate the option though, and at this point I virtually never use them, and I find the experience much more enjoyable that way. Turning sages off is also a nice way of artificially increasing the difficulty a little bit if you're finding the game a little bit too easy. One final thing on sages, and this is entirely me nitpicking about something that bothers me. What's with the Wind Sage in Tears? Tulin is clearly portrayed as a skilled but ultimately brash and overconfident child who is biting off way more than he can chew. But the moment Link joins him, Tulin is apparently justified in his overconfidence because the power of friendship or something like that. And then at the end of the arc, Tulin is unreservedly praised for his actions, becoming a sage and being granted the Great Eagle Bow. I just don't get what the point of this storyline is. Like, why didn't they just make Teba the Wind Sage? Tulin clearly isn't qualified for the responsibilities of Sage. I guess I could make the same statement about Yunobo, but that's neither here nor there. I don't know, maybe this is just a me problem. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Anyway, let's wrap this whole thing up. There are a few quick things to go over before final judgment, but they're all minor, so I'll just try to rapid fire through them. First, arrows are probably better in Breath of the Wild than in Tears of the Kingdom. Tears may offer more kinds of arrows, but having to pull up the quick menu for every arrow is really annoying. Second, gloom damage is an interesting way of adding some challenge to Tears of the Kingdom, but at the end of the day it can be completely bypassed by doing a little bit of preparatory cooking. Third, runes do have some impact on combat, but it is a surprisingly minimal difference. Breath of the Wild's remote bomb is nice for launching enemies and dealing early game damage, but that's about it. Tears of the Kingdom's Fuse rune lets you customize weapons, but for the most part it just increases your damage numbers. Apparently it increases weapon durability by a little bit, but not by an amount that's particularly noticeable. Fourth, you can build war machines in Tears of the Kingdom, but I don't think I can call using war machines combat. More like slaughter. Like most of the time the enemies don't even stand a chance. It's not a proper combat. Alright, For the final verdict, I think that it's pretty clear that Breath of the Wild has the better combat, partially because it has options with difficulty between normal mode and master mode, and partially because the champion's abilities are a lot more tolerable than the sage's abilities. Anyway, that's all for today. I think there's just 1 or 2 more videos I want to do in this series. Until then, have a nice day.